good phone case. Did you get to go this side?
We did go slow, but fast.
How long was he staying?
It was only tomorrow. You're taking the kids. Oh, well. You know.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Hope you've had a good weekend. Look at that. Wow. It's really not been that long of a week, I promise. I've been great till the last hour, and I don't know, it's like, why am I so tired? I got plenty of sleep last night, too, so I don't know what's up. Hope you've had a good week so far, and I hope it continues to get better and better and better. It has been brought to my attention there is a 35% chance of rain on Saturday. Keep posted on the Facebook page. I'm going to be praying for no rain because I really want to do some work. And if I don't do work here, that means I have to do twice as much work as the house. I want to do something, but I'd rather be here. Be looking for the Facebook page no later than 7 o'clock. That's the latest we'll make the call. Unless there's like a torrential downpour Saturday morning, we'll probably be doing stuff here. So I'm the kind of guy, I can work in the rain, it don't bother me, but I try to be considerate of other people so I don't get a bad rap on me. Kidding. No one's laughing. I'm a bad joke teller too. But keep posted. Huh?
You can't build a fire in it, right?
Well, that's true. I can't build a fire, but I can still run a weed eater. Just put on a cap over me and the top of the weed eater.
I'm still bringing popcorn.
Oh, okay. With an umbrella. You can rely on Sandy. You can go through, I guess you can go through Logan's account or Luke's. Yeah, whichever account y'all go through. Or Chris and Candy will actually see it through there. Okay. So that'll be the outlet. Worst comes to worst and something happens with Facebook, you'll get a call from me. It won't be an emergency, but you'll get a call from me. I'm pretty sure I have everybody's number. So if you see a random number, it's not saved in your phone, it's probably me. And if they're selling you a lifetime warranty insurance, it's not me. But regardless of that, hope you've had a good week. Is there anybody that we do need to keep in our prayers?
His mom's sick.
Okay. Just falling back under the weather again?
She's got ear infection.
Okay. Praying for Jean White. And I do have an update. Notified Sunday morning, be praying for Sandy Ross. I called her this afternoon. At first, I was an insurance salesman, and then she identified who I was, and I was safe at that point. She's doing well. The surgery went well. She's going to be recovering for maybe about a month. She says she'll be away for a while. Then once she starts to get past the infectious or the possibility of getting some kind of infection, she'll be coming back here. She was actually very happy for the phone call. So it's like, oh, that was so sweet. Thank you. She was very nice about it. But she's doing well. Continue to pray for her for the recovery. I think there's some really good possibilities right there with her and her husband. So be praying for them, praying for that. Outside of that, be praying for the house-to-house, heart-to-heart newsletter. That is going out soon, either this week or next week in the community. But it's only like a selection. We've got a strategy that we're going to be working through, one section every 6 months, and they'll get 3 issues during that 6 months. But that first issue is going to be going out soon. The person who checks our mail is not here. He's getting that last free night. But be praying for that. Hopefully we can get some good seeds planted and start to set up some Bible studies is my hope. But outside of that, we have a lot of good things in store. I'm excited for the future. I'm excited for possibilities and even candidates we have sharing the gospel with. So with that in mind, and with our class in the hour, David, can you lead us in a prayer and we'll begin?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, dear Lord, bless us with. Dear Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to be here to learn more about your word, dear Lord. Dear Lord, people that are in you, please watch over them. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So we're going to go into a familiar text, or maybe we won't. Oh, man. Sandy, can you hit the little orange icon on the bottom? It should be right below that little crack between the two windows on the very bottom. Orange circle. Yes, thank you. Okay, so this is a very familiar text. When you look into Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, we see the creation of everything. And one of the greatest creations that we find in Genesis 2 is the institution of marriage. God looked at man and saw that it was not fit that he should be alone, so he made a help meet for him. I used to always think that was M-E-A-T, and I was like, that's a weird wording. But it's actually a helper who is meet for his needs, M-E-E-T. New King James says comparable to, someone that man can relate to. So he created this individual that is called woman, and God would say at the end of creating this union of marriage, therefore a man shall leave his his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, this is not just something that we kind of bring up when we talk about New Testament, the way that marriages are supposed to be today, but it's something it's existed since the first couple ever existed. Obviously, they maybe had a couple minutes before God said, okay, Eve, this is your husband. I didn't get to choose. Well, God made him perfect for you, but I don't know if perfect's the right word, but he gave you a husband. But it's good for us to realize some of the peculiarities or some of the special things in the Old Testament, and even some of the commonalities from Old Testament principles of marriage that even carry on to customs that we still practice today. Now, I have this listed as customs of the Old Testament because these are not commands. But when we think about a marriage or we think about a wedding, these are still common things that happen today. Sometimes parents are looking out for their children. I know of a couple of families here in America. It's not so much common in America as it is over in eastern soils. But sometimes the parents will look for the right kind of spouse for their child. And there's nothing wrong with wanting the right kind of spouse for your child. If you have a son, you want them to marry a daughter who's going to lead them to heaven. Vice versa, if you have a daughter, you're going to be very protective of who that daughter marries. Marry a man who's going to help you go to heaven. Sometimes parents are the ones who seek out and actually find the spouse for the individual. You look at Genesis chapter 24, and you see Abraham sends out his servant to go find Isaac a wife. Same thing in chapter 21 when Hagar, and not Ishmael. Is it Ishmael? No, I just drew a blank. What was Abraham's first? No. Ishmael. No?
Oh, his first son?
Yeah, Ishmael. Okay. I was like, Issachar for some reason is coming to mind, but that is not it. Ishmael. Hagar finds him a wife, and she was born in Egypt. However, there's a slight connection there, but we see an example of the parents going out and finding a spouse for the child. Sometimes fathers give away. I have that in quotations because it's not just here, you have her. But you know, customarily sometimes when a woman is being given away, the father will walk down the aisle with her or with grandpa or someone who's a guardian over them and say, do you give this woman to be married to this man? They say, I do, and there's that sentimental moment. Well, this is something that's traditional even in the Old Testament time. Genesis 29 and Exodus chapter 2, you see the giving away of, I think, Laban, giving away Rachel and Leah, giving them to Jacob. He had to give them away. Same thing in Exodus chapter 2, where Zipporah is given from Jethro. Now, I'm throwing out these Old Testament names. I think we're sometimes unfamiliar with the Old Testament, but it's good just to see these things. Some other customs that we see, sometimes daughters were literally given away to a man. You see David, who went and had to collect 300, I believe, foreskins of the Philistine. I think he got twice as much. But he exceeded Saul's expectations. I believe Michal was her name, was given to David in marriage. Same thing we see in Joshua 15. You see the daughter of Caleb. Caleb says, whoever destroys this group can have my daughter's hand in marriage. And Othniel, the first judge from the book of Judges, he's the one who is found victorious over this, and the narrative picks up in Judges chapter 3 on his story. Sometimes exchanging a wedding gift. You see kind of like wedding showers sometimes. Well, this is kind of that same idea we see. Wedding banquets, invitations, festivities. All of these are customs that have carried over from a long period of time. Now, you don't have to do these when you get married, and sometimes you can elope. You can just get married. Go to the courthouse, have a judge do it, done. You don't have to have a ceremony. Some people feel like you need to have a ceremony. But it's always good, just from wisdom. Always ask the person you're marrying, what do you want to do? Do you want a big shindig, or do you want it family only? Do you want to not tell anybody and you just want to pop it on them at one moment? There's some do's and don'ts in that. But there are some good practices that we see taking place in the Bible, but we don't always look at them because we're always looking at a bigger picture throughout the Bible. But what we're going to look at from the Old Testament in terms of marriage is we're going to look at two of the bigger problems. And I say problems, they're not problems, but they're questions that come up. Because if we claim to be Christians, we claim to believe in the Bible, and we do, and we are, these questions are going to come up. Well, why did God change from allowing polygamy in the Old Testament to where in the New Testament he suddenly changed? I thought God was unchangeable, and I thought his ways were always set in stone. He's never going to change it. Well, we need to know how to answer that. Well, what about the bill of divorce that the Pharisees would come before Jesus in Matthew 19, Mark chapter, I believe, 10, and even Luke chapter 16? When they came before Jesus, why did they mention this bill of divorcement? Well, that is a thing in Deuteronomy 24. We have to know why these things were done and or allowed in order to give a biblical answer. It doesn't mean there's a contradiction in Scripture, but it does give us a chance to study our Bibles and come up with an answer for it. So if we're going to start with polygamy, the first instance of polygamy, is it a sin? Let's just see how the Bible showcases, or it shows some examples of polygamy. The first example we see of a very wicked man by the name of Lamech. Took for himself 2 wives, and the name of one was Ada, and the name of the second was Zillah. Now, even though this particular man came from the line of Cain, and I believe if you recall in, I want to say it's Genesis 6, I believe it is, the sons of God and the daughters of men? Oh, okay, that's what it was. Daughters of men. I know it was something else. But it's showcasing those who were very worldly, and it has nothing to do with gender, just those who were very worldly and those who were trying to do what was right. And it got to a point where wickedness was just overcoming the world, and we see the instant of the flood. This particular wicked man did more than just take 2 wives. And it's not because he took 2 wives that's what makes it wrong, and or if it was even wrong in the eyes of God. Let's look at another passage to take into consideration. You look at Deuteronomy chapter 21. If you can see that, that's good. If not, you might want to mark this in your Bible. It was written in the law, not that you cannot marry more than one spouse. In the old law, that was not written explicitly. However, there were conditions at times, because there may be a case, and we're not going to read through this particular part of the law, but if you were married to your spouse, well, I'd imagine you'd be married to them. They're your spouse. Your spouse, they end up dying, and they have siblings, and you're a woman, more than likely you're going to be married to an eligible sibling, whether or not they're married or not, because that was part of the Old Testament law. I forget what the actual, it'll come to me a little bit later on, But the siblings were in charge of carrying on the seed line for their fallen brother who passed away, should something happen to them, and that was just part of the law. It was God's way of protecting the future of that particular family. And it wasn't that God was trying to promote incest or anything, or try to promote polygamous marriages, but he was trying to work within the structure that he had established for the people at that time. And he's not trying to find loopholes or jump to weird possibilities, but look at what he says as kind of a bylaw if someone marries more than one woman. He would say if a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, I believe King James would say one loved and the other hated, they have borne children, both the loved and the unloved. If the firstborn son is of her who is unloved, so the one who is loved less, not necessarily not loved at all, but just that's not the husband's favorite. And that's one of the problems God was trying to present. Look, if you have more than one spouse, you're going to play favorites. You just are. There's no way of getting around that. I think that's why in the general instruction from Genesis 2, that is the original formula that God had set in place for a perfect union. One man, one wife. Otherwise, we're going to start seeing favoritism. And it's going to be the case that if the firstborn son comes from the one who is loved less in this particular marriage, that firstborn son, should that man die, all that inheritance is going to go to that firstborn son. Even if the wife who is loved bears a child, that firstborn child of that particular wife is not going to receive the inheritance, because according to the man, that would be his second child. So it's going to present some problems. And God says, look, if you're going to get involved with this, just know that there's going to be some problems coming later down the road. And this was one of the warnings that God gave to the kings of Israel. He would say, don't multiply to yourself horses. Don't multiply to yourselves wives. If you multiply wives for yourself, lest your heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. And in the verses after, it would say he needs to write his own copy of the book from the priest. Keep it near him. He needs to learn the law of the land, or the law of God. Now, what God is not saying is the king of Israel cannot have an army. The king of Israel cannot have treasure, nor the king of Israel cannot have more than one wife. You look at the case of David. David had multiple wives. Not as many wives, I believe it's 1 Kings 11, maybe verse 1. How many wives did Solomon have? This is Bible trivia. I'm not.
300 concubines.
But I would think it would be that.
300 concubines.
300 concubines.
And
700 wives. That's enough time for maybe half a day for each wife, and then you still don't get through them all. Well, no, you probably would. You'd have some free time at the end of the year just to do more planning. That's a little difficult. And even if it were vice versa, one woman with 700 husbands, you don't really hear about that in the Old Testament simply because of the structure of how men kind of saw themselves more of a superior type thing in some cases. But even in that time, the nearest people would abuse the gender roles. God puts this command here in place for the king to say, look, if you have too many rods or irons in the fire, you're not going to be able to focus on what you need to. And you know what Solomon's biggest problem was, is that his wives did turn his heart away from the Lord to serve their gods. And when you see, I think it's the first wife of Solomon. Do you know where she was from? I think it would say that Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh. Egypt. Married an Egyptian. Of course, she's going to turn his heart away to her gods, because there's like more than one. And thinking of Solomon, if he truly had a heart like his father David, he would have simply said, no, we can't do this. He would try to convert her rather than her converting him. And what's sad is that even though we'll get to this principle here in a moment, even though there are marriages going on today, whether it's a Christian to a Christian or a Christian to a non-Christian, or even two non-Christians who end up coming to Christ later in life, it seems to be the case a lot of times when you have a Christian marry a non-Christian, the Christian falls away because simply they want to keep that marital bond perfect in peace and harmony. But if you've been married too long, you know there's going to be a couple of disagreements along the way, whether it's about religion or not. You're still going to have those little fights, and or those little fights that might turn up into big fights. But you resolve those to keep the peace between the both of you. Now, religion seems to be one of those sensitive matters that most male Christians or female Christians, they allow their spouse's beliefs to drag them away. And we're going to see here in a little bit, according to 1 Peter chapter 3, the wife should live in a way, and even a husband, if the husband is a Christian and the wife is not, the wife should live in a way to where her example, the way she lives, she acts, and that she even takes, I guess, whether it's like little snide comments or something about their religion, live in such a way that you can win your spouse over to Christ. That is possible, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But going back to polygamy, if it was advised against the people, look, this is going to be a problem. Should you involve yourself in this? And even the king of Israel. I want you to look at a New Testament principle. If it was not forbidden in the Old Testament, because we don't see a specific forbiddance, God does not say, I'm going to strike Moses dead, I'm going to strike David dead, I'm going to strike Solomon dead. He simply puts up those warning signs. If you look at Romans chapter 7 and verse 3, in the New Testament, this is the system. If while her husband lives, and this is after verse 1 and 2, a man is under the law so long as he lives, and he uses this example of a marriage relationship. If a husband is married to a wife, and we're not going to put any kind of conditions on this, if they're married, and they're married right in the eyes of God, that is a legitimate marriage. Now, if in the middle of this marriage, if the husband is still alive, he has done absolutely nothing wrong, he's still pure in the marital relationship. If the wife were to go out and just marry another man, so now she, quote unquote, has two husbands, the Bible would say she shall be called an adulteress. Why is that? Under the New Testament law, God makes it very specific. Look, if your spouse is alive, there is no committed of adultery or fornication, as we'll talk about here in a moment, within that relationship with another individual who is not part of the marital bond. That's wrong. And it continues with this, her husband, if the husband dies. So now we look back at this pure relationship. If the husband dies, now the woman is free to marry whoever she wants to. But notice it's only a 1-to-1 ratio. There is not more. Now, this is not the case that if you are married, you can no longer marry again. Should you have a good relationship, nothing sour happens in the marital relationship, no one's put away, it's a pure marriage. Your spouse dies and you're by yourself. Well, you have the right to be remarried should you choose. Otherwise, it wouldn't say that she is freed from that law. No, she is bound to live single the rest of her life. Paul doesn't say that. But rather it would say, look, if she decides to marry another man after her spouse dies, that's fine. It works the same way with a man. If the wife dies and that spouse or the man is looking to marry again, that is fine. You see the same thing in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 2. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife. Not saying the wife dies and the husband is, or he's no longer a husband after she dies. If the wife dies and the man decides to marry again, that's okay. That's not violating this rule. It's simply saying if you are married, then you fulfill this requirement, this particular requirement. Same thing with a deacon. Let the deacons be the husband of one wife, ruling their children in their own house as well. So when I look at the idea of polygamy, under the Old Testament, it was allowed. For what reason, I do not know. But God simply allowed it. It doesn't make them more gracious under the old law because we're still saved by grace through faith. That has never changed. But the particulars under the New Testament law is a little bit more specific. One man, one woman. Now we come to a more complicated text in Matthew chapter 19. And when you look at Matthew chapter 19, I want to begin this. In Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16, we need to understand because God's design for the marital relationship was to be between one man and one woman. God does not like the idea of separation. Now, there are going to be a lot of conditions that people are going to say, what about this? What about this? What about this? Let's not throw all those out right here. Just know God does not like. Doesn't mean he won't allow. But there is only two conditions we're going to find that God will allow a scriptural divorce within a marriage. Now, the reason he would say this in Malachi chapter 2 is we're going to see here when we look into Jeremiah chapter 3. Israel had committed adultery against God, committed herself to the harlotries of the other gods of the pagan nations. And God says, look, you have committed adultery against me. I now throw you out. You are no longer my beloved bride. My bride has adulterated herself. She has blemished herself. I don't want to see this. God sometimes uses that to show our religious relationship with him, but he does that quite often in saying, look, you're the one who divorced yourself from me. So he hates separation in the sense of divorce. Now, when we look at Matthew 19, I don't have this on the screen, but I do want to go through this so you can kind of put the pieces together. It would say Matthew 19, beginning in verse 3. Jesus has already departed from Galilee. He's come into the regions of Judea, and a great multitude followed him, verse 2, and he healed them there. Then the Pharisees came to him, testing him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, notice the next phrase, for just any reason? Every situation that could possibly happen in the marital relationship, the Pharisees have just thrown on the table. See how Jesus responds. Jesus answered and said to them, verse 4, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning, and this is the reference back to Genesis chapter 1 that we're going to see here in a moment, which I'll just go to that real fast. It might help if I put that up there. Genesis chapter 1, 27 and also 2. He would say, did you not read that he who made them male and female, or made them at the beginning, made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Now, what Jesus has just said is, look, can a man marry or divorce, same thing with a woman, for just any reason? And Jesus said, look, the original plan is that once they're married for life. Now, what's sad is selfishness, lust, and personal desires tend to set in to where there's abuse within the marital relationship. What I mean by that is defilement of the marriage bed. Husbands going off and seeking other women, and it could be vice versa, the wife going off and seeking other men who is not their spouse. Jesus said God made this marriage where, look, if you've got a problem, and it might be anger issues, it might be patience issues, it might be something silly about you didn't wipe the counters right, something stupid. And some people might say, yeah, I'll show you stupid. No, little silly quibbles. You know what I mean with this. The idea is Jesus says, you can work those out. There are ways to work through those problems. And then what they're going to say is, okay, if God made this union to last forever, and that's the ideal marriage, to last as long as both the husband and the wife live together, then why did, verse 7, why did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce to put her away? Why did Moses suddenly give this golden ticket, so to speak? Not to Willy Wonka's factory, but to get out of the marriage. Why did Moses do this? And what's sad is they're throwing this on Moses. But who had to give the law in order to give it to the people? Who spoke it? God. That's God's law. Moses didn't command this. But look, because they're placing Moses in the place of God, look at how Jesus responds to this. He said, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Now, when you go to Deuteronomy, hold your finger there, we'll come back. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 24, Deuteronomy 24. This is very important to note. That way when you read through this text or through Mark's account or even Luke's, you have a general idea of what's going on. Now, if you recall, we've talked about this in prior lessons. The purpose of the Old Testament law was to promote life. It was to give blessing. It was to protect God's people from those who would either, one, abuse the law, or two, abuse God's people. He wanted them to have a good future, a bright future, but he also wanted them to be holy, sanctified, obedient, faithful. Now, with that in mind, because the law was given to protect, see what God commands here in chapter 24, and you might be able to pick it up as we read, but I'll give you my thoughts after we read this. Chapter 24, beginning in verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he found some uncleanness in her. So it's not that she's lost interest, but suddenly the husband's just like, yeah, I don't like you, and wants to divorce. He writes her, it found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. When she has departed from his house, so now they are separated according to this certificate, she goes out and becomes another man's wife. If the latter husband, sorry, someone just called, that threw me off. If the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hands and sends her out of his house. So, if now the second husband says, you know, I just don't like you. I don't think this is going to work. Sorry. He writes her a certificate. Or, if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife. So, in one sense, he may have said, you know what, I just don't like you, gives her a certificate. Or, she has that original certificate from the first husband, but then her husband dies that she's now married to. If the former husband who divorced her, or then her former husband who divorced her cannot or must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. She's in this relationship and she can't go back. God would say this would be considered an abomination before the Lord. You shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, notice, Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart, this was allowed. Now, what was not allowed was the abuse of the law. That would be on the man who was abusing the law. If he simply wanted to be a womanizer of sorts and just go around and lay with every beautiful or pretty face that he sees, or every giggly Nancy that walks across the Sinai wilderness, I don't know how to say that better, but hey, I like you, I don't like you, here's your paper. Hey, I like you, I don't like you, here's your paper. It was to protect the sake of the woman. And it wasn't supposed to show, oh, this is a very loose and a very lewd woman. No, rather it was to protect that very woman so that society would look down on her and say, well, you're a harlot. You're just trying to get with every man that you can. No, because men, we know quite often, too many times we think with our pleasure, we think with anger, and that's just one of those things that we have to work on. Even sometimes it can work vice versa with the women. But even in Hebrew times, ancient Israel, the men were abusing this because of the hardness of their heart. God gave this law to protect women. And then some women, I'm not saying you, but some women turn around and say, well, the God of the Old Testament just hated women. No, he protected them. He protected them, he protected their bodies, he protected their babies. He wanted life and blessing to happen to the women, and not just women only, but also the men who really wanted to keep the law the way God intended. Now, with this in mind, go back to Matthew chapter 19. Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses gave you this certificate, but it was only because God said, look, this is going to happen. I want you to do this to protect the women. Now that he has clarified this and said, look, there are people who abuse the law, Jesus is now about to give the only, or one of the two only ways that an individual can put away their spouse. It would say in Matthew 19, beginning in verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except it be for, New King James says sexual immorality, the King James says fornication. We need to realize sexual immorality could be identified as, if we were to just look at that word and not look at the Greek, Sexual immorality could be me lusting for someone else. It could be me violating and committing adultery within my heart and not actually being with a woman. The idea behind this word, because King James uses fornication, if there is a physical interaction that melds itself into where the marriage relationship should be, but now I am violating that relationship so I can be with some other individual. That's the fornication Jesus is talking about. When I commit an act with someone else, I've now violated my vow to my spouse. Jesus says, unless if it is for that, if someone goes out and marries another individual, they commit adultery. Because they decided, well, we're going to get divorced for whatever reason. And this is where things start to get a little emotional. What if my husband beats me? Well, you have the right to call the cops. You have the right to seek out counsel. That's not adultery. What if my husband is a drinker? Well, you have the right to find them counsel. You have the right to call the police if things get restless. But that's not adultery. Well, what if I try to set up my spouse so they do cheat on me and I just can't handle this anymore, and I caught them in the act because I had set it all up. I withheld my body for them so that all those hormones would build up and they go looking for someone else. No. According to 1 Corinthians Chapter 7, your body belongs to your spouse and vice versa. Now, granted, that should not be abused within the marital realm, but if you're withholding yourself just so your spouse can slip up and trip, you are at fault. That is not the biblical definition of me going out because you didn't cause me to do this. I just chose to do it. Commit adultery against my marriage relationship. That's not going to work. There's a lot of emotional responses that we end up setting up these situations. And Jesus says, look, I'm going to make it simple. If you violate your vow, and that's all you knowingly, you are violating your vow, you've committed adultery. That is the only reason besides, according to Romans chapter 7, death of your spouse. Now, I'm going to presume you didn't kill your spouse. That gets a little tricky, but we're going to presume it's natural causes. And not that you're trying to hide the real cause, but it's actual natural causes. Jesus says, unless it's for that, you cannot divorce them. And I think that was a huge boulder thrown on the Pharisees. Because they initially came in with, we know you can't be divorced for any reason. But sadly, what was happening within Israel is the men were divorcing their wives for just any reason. I'm not saying all men, but some of the men, even the Pharisees, even those of the Sanhedrin, some of them were abusing that privilege. And I don't even know if privilege is the right word, because if you use it against what it was, it was placed to protect the women. If that was your reason, I don't like you because you're just not pretty, yeah, it's kind of a bad reason. And I'm trying to think from a lady's perspective. You might get more than words. You might get a little skin there too. But the idea, Jesus says, look, you only have two reasons. And when you look at the New Testament institution of marriage, it's always been, and it's supposed to be, holy, sacred. One man, one woman. You see in Jeremiah 3, the verse I'd already alluded to, which is actually a little bit further back, the idea of God being married to Israel, he wants a pure relationship. You look in Revelation, though we're not going to look at it in pictures of Revelation, the idea of the Lamb waiting for his bride, the church, she's pure, undefiled, wearing these pure white garbs, and the marriage feast is being prepared. The idea is purity, and that's supposed to be the idea within the marital relationship. The role of the husband to be the head of the home, the one who's supposed to be the spiritual guide, guiding their wives, guiding their children, and even be that position just as Christ is over the church, as Christ gave himself for the church, which would mean I'm not leading the church in a different way because I've got some kind of obligation that's taking me away from God. I want to lead the church to God. That was Jesus' mentality. Now, the church, even though Christ is the head and the church is the body, the church is to be in subjection to the head. But they also work hand in hand in another way. It doesn't work the way that TV and magazines and even songs of today kind of presume love. That's kind of a blinded, foggy view of love. And if you try to live your marriage according to movies, TV, and music, you're going to have a terrible marriage. But when you live your marriage the way that God designed it, where you're both being submissive to each other. The woman is looking up to the husband, but the husband is taking into consideration the woman. He's adorning her as Christ would adorn the church. And the church is adoring him, adoring Christ. If it works that way, we would have much better marriages in this world, because that's simply the way that God designed it. And when we do it that way, then you will enjoy the benefits and the blessings that God has set in place. Now, the verse that I had alluded to, 1 Peter chapter 3, we need to keep this in mind. We do have individuals who are members of the church, and I'm not saying they're less of Christians because of this. That's not the case. The people who say Christians should marry a Christian, I think that is very wise advice. But Paul also said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, look, there's no command against this idea. It's just unwise to do so because of that Deuteronomy 17 principle. There's going to be bad influences. They might take away your faith. It should be the case that if we have the best interest for each other, we're both going to want to go to heaven. That means at times maybe I'm the one who needs to be humble, and I need to submit or take into consideration the idea of my spouse, who is a Christian, and lead them to Christ. Well, they need to humble. But it takes work, and there's some people who are very hesitant about this. But let's think of it this way. Well, I want to be patient with this. I don't want to push them too much. There is some wisdom to that. But what if Christ were to come back tonight, and you said it's okay for my spouse to be outside of Christ? You think God would buy that? If all it would take is us praying for those couples who are struggling to bring their spouses to Christ, I think it'd be good from time to time to just ask, hey, how are you doing working with your spouse? We're praying for them. We want the best for you. Is there any way that we can help you out in bringing them to the church? And it might not be a face-to-face conversation. It might be sending a card, sending a food basket, sending them a book, giving them a phone call. There's multiple ways of reaching out to people. But I think too many times that we don't want to go into that area of discussing religion in our marriages because we feel like it'll ruin our marriage. Friends, God designed and built marriage. It's not going to ruin your marriage. It's going to strengthen your marriage. When you have two people whose goal is heaven and their sights are on God and God is first in their life, and then you start focusing on the marriage, that's what we're aiming for, because that's what God built. The last thing, the mutual agreement to fast, this is one of those things that we kind of overlook. Because of the present circumstance in Corinth at this time, there was a lot of persecution. There were times where people would go from door to door and say, are you a Christian? Because people started finding out Christians are not the same as Jews. They have different beliefs. One is upholding this Jesus as king, and the other one is still looking for this coming Messiah, and they're under the old law. When Rome started figuring that out, in Corinth especially, there was some persecution going upon those Christians. And at times it might cause some stress on particular marriage relationships. You would have a Christian married to a non-Christian because Corinth was a huge pagan worship site. Even though that was the case and that existed, Paul said, look, if you want to give yourself over to fasting and prayer and you want to withhold yourselves, mutually withhold yourselves from enjoying intimacy together so that you can give more time to your meditation and focus to God, and you both agree on that, you have the right to do that. But don't do it too long, lest Satan gain advantage of you. I find a lot of couples don't actually practice this. But it's not me trying to barge into their business. It's just me talking to other preachers and what they have gathered from talking to people. But it's not a bad practice. And this is the main reason why I say it's probably not a bad practice. You know, Jesus went to the wilderness. He withstood Satan. And I realize that that's not a marriage relationship. But in another sense, Jesus was trying to show and trying to build his purity and devotion to God. I think it can actually strengthen our relationships and actually make those intimate relations that we have with our spouse even stronger. And we appreciate them more because we're giving ourselves to God, but then God also says, you've done well. Go enjoy the blessing that I've given you within this marriage. I think that can be strengthened at times, but that's a study for another time. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at the idea of to tithe or not to tithe. What's the idea of the law of Moses of tithing, and is tithing still applicable today? And it depends on who you ask, but most people are going to say, well, I tithe every Sunday. Is that a New Testament principle? That's what we need to ask. Lord willing, we'll get to that next Wednesday. Sunday morning, those who are viewing live stream, we're glad you could be with us. Be with us at 10 a.m. We'll have a pre-recorded Bible class. And then at 11 a.m., we will look at the beauty of holiness for this coming Mother's Day. So until we meet again, God be with you, and thank you for your attention.